In this episode, we're talking all about yoga sequencing, and specifically bigger picture sequencing when it comes to the general arc of a yoga class, not so much the sequencing on an individual pose to pose level. But for a good look at yoga sequencing at the finer level, pose to pose wise, we have a blog post on Jenni's blog called Yoga Pose Counterpose Rules. Are they necessary? And the link to that will be in the show notes. So let's just get right into it. And my first question for you, Jenni, is what is sequencing and why does it matter?
Well, I think that's a very good question. And to me, yoga sequencing matters because it basically helps create a meaningful experience, or at least like layer on intention behind what a yoga teacher chooses to teach in class or how they design the overall class. Because otherwise, you could have people on the mat and just lead them through any random assortment of yoga poses. And that's totally fine and would have its own benefits. But the sequencing kind of gives that overall thread that ties everything together, kind of weaves it together into one package so that people leave class with some like impression or experience, or maybe a shift in understanding about their body, or I mean, it can be so many things. But to me, basically, yoga sequencing is like how you weave together an entire practice to layer on some sense of meaning and purpose so that it's not just a bunch of random movements thrown together. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it kind of reminds me, and this isn't an accurate representation, but of CrossFit. It's because people talk about CrossFit like, oh, it's just some random assortment of exercises, and it's not like a well thought out program, right? Which isn't really true. That's kind of like a naive understanding of CrossFit. And when CrossFit is done well, it's more of a like what you're describing, of a nicely sequenced and put together movement package, as opposed to just like randomly choosing exercises. But that's the perception that people have, and it also reminds me of the distinction that some people make between exercise and training, where it's like exercise is just kind of random without a really big picture,
Yeah.
thought process of what you're doing, whereas training is like a more well thought out in advance. Here's what I'm trying to get out of it. Here's how I'm going to lay things out.
Those are such interesting distinctions. And I hadn't even thought about that. And I mean, I've heard a lot of critiques of CrossFit, and I know that they are not all well founded, but I'm not sure that I've heard that exact critique
Oh
about
yeah,
it being
people are
just
just
like
like, oh, it's just random, you know, no rhyme or reason to the exercises or the order or the what you're doing, and that's not, maybe poorly executed CrossFit is that, but
right.
the people who are you see on TV and doing it well, they clearly have a good plan.
That totally makes sense. And it also makes me think about how before we started our Strength for Yoga program, which is kind of this like monthly strength programs over time with different themes for each month. Before that, I still got so many benefits out of my own personal strength practice, but I definitely wasn't packaging my strength work into the kind of this overarching. Now I'm talking more. This isn't just like the overarching arc of one workout, but a
Right, because
plan over
you were
time.
planning individual workouts, but not
That's
uh,
right.
a week at a time or whatever. You were kind of day
Yeah,
to day, which is
I was day to
maybe,
day.
yeah, which is maybe what yoga teachers do, I would say, when they're thinking about sequencing, unless maybe they are teaching a class, 3 days a week or whatever, and they're like, well, I'm going to do this on this day and this on that day.
Yeah, which they might. I mean, maybe they have people in like an 8 week yoga program with like a certain specific goal, and this whole group sticks together over
Yeah.
time.
So if you know that you're having the same students either on a week to week or they're coming in multiple times, you wouldn't necessarily do the same. You would think about that, right? Like, oh, last
Yes.
week we did this week. So there's sequencing at the level of what are we going to do today that's different from the next time, and then there's just what are we going to do today?
Absolutely. And I feel like for the purposes of this conversation in this podcast, like most yoga teachers on a day-to-day basis, say you're teaching at like a busy yoga studio and you teach multiple classes a week and your students, it's a different assortment every time. So for most yoga teachers in that setting in practical sense, it's mostly like, what am I going to do today? We're talking about sequencing within one day, not necessarily over time.
Yeah.
But it is
That can
interesting
be that can be a future episode.
Yeah, exactly. How you might design yoga over time with like a sense of progression and purpose. But for today, we're just talking about from the opening to the closing of one yoga practice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So why, you alluded to this before, but why does it matter? Or what happens if you don't have you don't have sequencing in mind as a teacher? What happens for the students in that class?
That's a good question. Well, I think, again, maybe a lack of some potential impression or sense of meaning that someone can take away with them. Possibly without intention behind one's sequencing, I think that there may be a lack of the ability to teach as effectively or for like learning opportunity to happen. There still would be really great movement taking place and all of the benefits that we get from that and mobilizing and paying attention to the body and the breath without like intentional sequencing. But I think when you layer on intentional sequencing, then you have the opportunity to really design the class from beginning to end. And maybe you had some sort of purpose or theme or teaching that you really wanted to weave in on whatever level or whatever that looks like. I think that can come across more effectively when it's sequenced well or sequenced with intention.
So you can get a lot of general benefits, but we're talking about like the last 20% or maybe more, but of making it a really cohesive experience, as opposed to just doing things in a not very well thought out order. And so I think that leads into my next question for you is, what are some of the common ways that yoga classes are sequenced?
So there's a wide variety of themes and focuses that you can weave in when you're sequencing a class. And it can really vary on yoga style or teacher preference. We also know that there are some styles of yoga where the sequences are non-varying. So for example, like Bikram yoga, which is always the same set of 26 poses and always practiced in the heat at some specific...
They must be very well thought out. Otherwise, why would anybody do the same 26 things every time? They must have a good order.
Right, exactly. It must be like perfect for them. And then in the Ashtanga system, that is also non-varying, although they do have... it technically goes up to 6 different sequences, although hardly any human mortal makes it up to like 5 and 6. Most people are doing the first or the first and the second. But even so, those are really set sequences that don't vary. So like teachers of Ashtanga and teachers of Bikram, they don't really even have to worry about sequencing. It's not, they have a lot of other things and other skills that they work on as teachers, or can utilize as teachers, but sequencing isn't something that comes into the equation.
Is that always true? Because I thought, and maybe I'm wrong, but I thought I had taken an Ashtanga class years and years ago, and I don't remember it being the exact same sequence over time. Maybe it wasn't actually Ashtanga. I mean, the teacher, that was what she was trained in. So maybe it was Ashtanga-like, but... It
might have been like Ashtanga influenced. If it wasn't the set sequence of like the primary series or the intermediate or the quote advanced series is what they call third. If it wasn't one of those, then it wasn't traditional Ashtanga.
Okay.
Because that's always Mysore style traditional Ashtanga in the tradition of Sri Patabi Joyce is always this like set sequence. Some teachers... in that tradition, I mean, sometimes they take a little bit of leeway to offer some modifications.
Right.
Sometimes,
yeah.
but they don't change the sequence that I know of, no. So yeah, I actually remember you, I think, mentioning that before.
Yeah, my whole...
I've taken an Ashtanga class.
My whole Ashtanga identity is a lie.
Right, it's not a lie. But I bet that teacher was using the term loosely. I think there are people out there who might...
before I understood it better from you, my... naive understanding was, it's just a vigorous flow, which is just more of a...
is.
Yeah, but that technically would be like a vigorous vinyasa flow, right?
flow.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so vinyasa flow, which in my impression, that's one of the most common styles of yoga that we have on our hands. Vinyasa flow is a style that is not a set sequence, and it changes every time. And so that's an example of a class where teachers of vinyasa flow or flow yoga or hatha yoga, I mean, really just all the other types of gentle yoga, restorative yoga, all the others, Iyengar yoga, those sequences vary. And so because of that, the teachers they need to be intentional. They need to think about, some teachers think about it as they go. Some teachers wing it as they teach, but it's still intentional. They're still deciding. Right, I know. I'm more of a...
The thought of going into a class without a plan. I admire a teacher that can do that. Or even I mean, like you don't have it written down necessarily anywhere. It's just in your head. Right. I'm like, holy crap.
That's true. And some teachers write it down and have notes like with them right in front of their mat. And I think that is also totally fine. Like there's nothing wrong with that. Although I have heard people be a little judgy about that for some reason, and I question that because I think you just want a well-designed class that makes layers on that meaning and that container for an experience that we want. Who cares how the person, whether they memorize it or are reading it or are coming up with it on the fly? I mean, you like their sequencing when you like their sequencing. I don't know. But anyway, you had asked about what were some of the common methods of sequencing.
Right.
And so I'll just go over like a few, but like one common way that a teacher may theme or sequence a yoga class is kind of more around like a biomechanical focus. So something like maybe we are strengthening a particular set of muscles today. Maybe I'm teaching a yoga class with an emphasis on posterior chain strength or glute strength or something, or core strength, like abdominal strength. So you could do something like strength. You could do something like mobilizing or mobility work for a particular area. Maybe you're teaching a class on, say, hamstring flexibility. Now I'm using kind of flexibility and mobility to be similar in terms, but maybe a class on hamstring flexibility, where maybe you sequence a lot of maybe passive and active ways of stretching and targeting the hamstrings that way, something like that. Other ideas for biomechanical considerations are like a skill, like maybe you're working on balance and it's a balance themed yoga class. And so you incorporate a lot of single leg balances, or maybe even quadruped hands and knees, lifting a foot and a leg, which is still a balance, but maybe in a different sense. So things like that, like you pick a biomechanical theme and kind of weave it throughout the class.
So either a muscle or a region of the body, more anatomical, or more of a skill. Some sort of
skill,
either flexibility or strength or balance.
Yeah,
and that's
exactly.
That's kind of the theme that you're operating in or continually revisiting.
That's right, exactly. You're kind of using that to inform and theme your class for the day.
I've definitely had experiences where I get to class and the teacher says, "So what do you all want to?" Sometimes it's, "We're going to work on this today," and sometimes it's, "What do you all want to work on today?" And everybody says the same 5 things: tight hamstrings, or whatever. Yeah.
Right. And maybe the teacher kind of knows that they're going to get like a handful from a handful of selections.
It's like a musician taking requests, but then knowing what they're going to play anyway.
But at least giving the illusion
impression.
Or the impression.
Yeah.
That's
Did I hear somebody say? Yeah.
They're like picking it out of the crowd, but no one really said that.
Yeah.
It's really funny. So anyway, biomechanical focus, but then you could also do something like a theme of class around, say, a type of yoga pose. So heart openers, which is kind of like the yoga word for back bends, or forward folds. So a moment ago, I mentioned like hamstring flexibility, but maybe you're just forward folds in general, and all the shapes, like the different asanas that can embody what a forward fold is. Arm balances, things like that. Like you pick a family, a pose, and then you make your yoga sequence kind of woven around that theme. So picking, something like that. Balance poses, twists. Another way that people might sequence the class is more kind of like maybe an energetic impression that they want the class to leave, their students to leave with. So maybe something like, quote, an energizing sequence. So I want my students to leave energized today. And so you weave together the poses in a manner in which in your mind, they would leave feeling energized, or calmness, or groundedness, or relaxing. So like restorative and gentle tend to be more geared toward leaving people more relaxed and
And
calm.
the energizing versus down regulating or relaxing, those are sometimes paired with back bending and forward folding, right? So
Yeah.
like back bending is energizing. You don't buy that though.
No, really. That's widely taught that like back bends are supposedly all quote stimulating. This is, I mean, of course, depends on the source, but this I find to be a wide claim in the yoga world. Back bends are stimulating, and forward folds are calming or relaxing. And like these categories of poses are just given these names or these descriptions for the effects that they have on the body. And I'm really familiar with those, but I feel like that's an oversimplification of how
Sure.
human bodies and movement work. And for example, like, is that to suggest that Urdhva a full body back bend, would be energizing because that's a back bend. But what about crow pose, which is an arm balance and your spine is in the opposite direction, so it's a forward fold. But it's still a super effortful movement because you're holding yourself with all your upper body and core strength. So is the idea that Urdhva Dhanurasana would be stimulating, but crow pose would be relaxing and calming just because of 1 year in extension and in 1 year in flexion? Like, to me, that just seems oversimplified.
There you go. Myth debunked.
Exactly. We have a great blog post on the blog, which is 3 claims yoga teachers should stop making about the body. I think that's the title. We'll link it in the show notes. And it was written by these awesome special guest teachers. And in that blog post, they talked about just suggesting that we not make so many assumptions and claims as to the effects that the yoga poses that we teach or the sequences that we teach will have on students' bodies. Do you know
I don't
the post
even
I'm talking
know.
about?
Yeah, and I don't know if they actually mentioned those specifically, but that's a nice application of, oh yeah, like not everybody's going to experience a back bend as energized. Like
As a
back bends tire me
stimulating.
out.
Yeah, right.
Not that that's the. They could tire you out and still leave you energized, as opposed to like, because tiring you out isn't the same as
That might
calming you
be
down.
like, that's so true. That's like I'm wiped out, which is like a
Yeah.
different effect. Yeah. Yeah. I think that on a musculoskeletal or a biomechanical level, I think we can talk about the effects. Like, we know that a certain way of doing a movement may potentially strengthen the glutes or so. Like, we know that, and we could probably talk about that. But beyond like stretching and strengthening and the way that those target the body, I think when we get beyond that into these other realms, it's not so black and white, and I'm not sure how helpful it is to make these assumptions about how poses will affect people. But it's certainly sorry.
I think the only thing that you can really say like that the effect would be is if you tell the person that back bends are energizing and that's what they think, then there's something to
Because you planted
the thinking that's
That's a really
there
great point. So you might.
in isolation, if novices took a back bend class and you interviewed them afterwards versus a forward fold randomized crossover design, and you said which one made you feel energized and which one made you feel more calm, I don't know I don't think it would necessarily bear out the way that you would expect.
That is such a great point. I'm sure no one would ever conduct a study like that, but wouldn't that be interesting? Maybe we could do an informal, anyway, something like a poll or a survey. But I think it'd be hard for us to find.
You're not going to find people who don't know those things, maybe in your
or
Instagram
haven't been
audience,
subjected to those suggestions.
That would be interesting. How do you find back bends, or do you find back bends energizing? Yes or no?
Yeah, totally. Yeah,
Put it on the list.
Oh, I will. That's a really good thought. So anyway, there are a lot of other themes and ways people can think about yoga sequencing. You can sequence around again, and then this gets a little cross, like bringing emotions and psychology in. Sometimes I wonder if that's crossing boundaries a little too much, but I know that there can be classes themed around like letting go, like an emotion. Or classes themed around grief, or classes themed...
And the poses would be selected and sequenced in such a way to do that, or it's more the the cueing surrounding it, or both?
That's a great question. I think in those cases it's probably more how the language and the cueing surrounds and contains the physical asanas being done, packaging them that way. But maybe a teacher could layer on a sense of how they understand that yoga poses may affect the body. But that could just
Yeah.
be another way that they might
Yeah.
sequence.
That is tough though, because one only has their own experience to say, well, this is how this
Yeah.
affects my body. And maybe you could ask, you have enough experience with students and kind of reading the room to see how they're responding, but not it. It's you're never going to have everybody walk out of there feeling energized or feeling calm because of the because you chose back bends or forward folds as the
That's such a good point.
theme.
Because as you were saying that, I was just thinking, well, I think, if someone leaves a restorative class, you probably could have an assumption they're probably going to leave that class feeling more downregulated. But is
Sure.
that about the overall style of the class, or is it about that it was back bends or forward folds?
Well, wait. So that is a question, right? So is a restorative class in general more biased to forward folds?
That's a
Or
great
like, do they not backbend in a restorative class?
No.
Really?
Yeah, at least in my experience of restorative is there are restorative backbends and there are restorative forward folds. There are restorative twists.
Oh,
They're
so
kind of all of it.
they do backbends in a restorative class. That's fair game.
Yeah, like you can do something called like supported fish, which is like lying on your back and you're propped up underneath. It feels really good.
The dissonance here.
I know that's so true because I think also within restorative yoga, it's also probably taught that different families of poses do have these different effects. But anyway, but it's more the style of being supported on these props and just relaxing, probably regardless of shape, position, but more
Yeah.
just like
And that
the
makes
fact that you're
sense.
supported. Yeah, totally.
So what
So-
other ways of sequencing are there?
You could also sequence around like just like a broader cult. This would be more about, I think, the language and what people talk about in the class, but you could sequence around like a cultural theme or event like the New Year. So I'm going to teach a New Year's class or a gratitude class. You could teach that anytime, but especially like we find those around Thanksgiving. So that's like a major national holiday, and that might influence how you might sequence or talk about or put poses together. And you could also sequence around specific populations. So if you have a prenatal population, or if you're teaching athletes or, things like that, you're teaching a specific community, then maybe you would sequence with their activity or whatever the theme that they all identify with, how that is connected. But there is one type of sequencing that really many of the ones I've already mentioned are also really, there's a lot of overlap, of course. Things aren't like so distinct, but I would suggest that the most popular and widespread type of sequencing for a yoga class is called peak pose sequencing. Peak pose sequencing. So that's like the most common method. And like I said, some of these other things that I mentioned can be included, like you might teach a class themed around gratitude, but it still most likely will have a peak pose overall arc, like peak pose sequencing and forming it.
Mm-hmm.
And you've heard of peak pose sequencing before, right? We've talked about it
I
before.
have. Yes.
It's very common.
So what how does it work?
The way that peak pose sequencing works is that the teacher will choose a quote peak pose or like an apex pose. And it's generally that pose is a pose that's considered to be extra challenging or difficult. And the way that the class is designed is to basically lead everybody up to that peak pose. And you lead them up like through, sometimes a lot of the language that's used around it is breaking the peak pose down into component parts. Just like smaller parts and body positions and movements that can make up this grander, more whole body peak pose. And you like kind of weave those component parts throughout the class. You might teach certain skills that are involved in that peak pose leading up to the peak pose. So you prepare people for the peak pose all throughout most of the class. Like I'd say in most examples, it's like the first 3/4 of the class is like warm up and then prep and component parts and everything leading up. And then the peak pose generally happens about 75%, 80% into the class. And that's where people do whatever it is, crow pose, handstand, arm balances and inversions are common. But it could also be like bendy, flexible poses that require a lot of flexibility. And sometimes all of like dancer pose, Natarajasana, is a standing single leg balance that's also a pretty big back bend. And that's a common one that's treated as a peak pose. So
So
after the
you
class, oh, sorry.
go ahead. Go ahead.
I'm almost done. After the class works on the peak pose, then the tail end of the class, and it's usually like the last 20% ish. These are just rough estimates. Then it's cool down. So, however, you cool down to wind down after the peak pose, and then Shavasana, and then it's over.
Got it. So maybe first 5 to 10 minutes is like centering, like getting into the breath in whatever pose you want to do. And then you have some sort of more dynamic warm up where you're moving through like gentler stretches. Yeah. And then you get into like some more vigorous movement. And then
Like sun salutations,
yeah.
maybe, and
then you're
pose
like
that.
ready for your peak pose. Or like, did I miss anything?
No. Yeah, like so more dynamic, whole like sun salutation-y, flowy things, standing poses, all of that kind of. Yeah, so you move a lot and exert a lot of energy on your path up, leading up to the peak pose and preparing people for the peak pose, all to kind of feed into students getting that peak.
So the idea is if you walked in, you wouldn't necessarily be able to get right into your handstand wheel, whatever back bend you're doing, whatever deep forward fold or twist you're doing. So we are very, very intentionally building up to that to give you, that's the word, methodically, building up to that to give you, all access throughout your body to the positions and connection to the muscles that you'll need to be able to express that position that the goal peak is, or the goal poses most, or embody it most effectively.
Exactly. Yes, I think you explained that perfectly well. Yeah, that's that is the most common way that yoga classes are sequenced to the peak pose model.
Yeah, what are the some of the benefits in your mind of doing it that way?
One way that I like about that approach is it often involves so you're building up to the peak pose. So over the course leading up to it, you're I don't know if all yoga teachers would use this term, but you may be teaching like regressions of the peak pose building up. So you do some form, and then maybe a little later you come back and you add something on that makes it more challenging and leading up. So I think it can be, I like that idea as far as educating people on the different stops along the way to the peak pose, so that when the class actually gets to the peak pose, people are informed on if they didn't feel ready or capable for the full, quote, full peak pose, they have already visited these other variations that they can feel comfortable taking and still feel like they're doing it.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. So could you give an example of a pose where, and some of the modifications that everybody might do it that way the first time, and then the second time you layer on something a little bit more, but then you still offer the option to repeat the way that it was done the first time? What would
So maybe something like just think of crow pose Bakasana, which is that classic. Well, it's like the logo of strength for yoga, but you're balancing on your hands and your knees are on your upper arms. So maybe that's your chosen peak pose. That's what you're working up towards. So along the way, I mean, there are a lot of ways this could look. Like one way could be you have people reclined on their back and they reach their arms toward the ceiling and draw their knees in, and they just show themselves that they can embody the shape of crow, and actually doing that still involves some core engagement. So it's still utilizing some muscle activity you want in final crow. But that would be a total that's a total regression, and also on the back. Then maybe, bring them into squat or malasana pose, which it's not the same, but it's a similar like flexion type shape. And then maybe malasana, bringing their hands down and just shifting their weight into their arms, but still keeping the feet on the floor. So that could be like a a third step toward crow pose. Then maybe people, I like feet on a block sometimes. So like perch with your feet on a block, then hands down. And then that starts you a little bit higher. So you're getting a little bit more toward lift off, maybe lift one foot off the block. Or if you're not using the block, just feet on the ground, lift one foot, lift the other. So just all these are kind of stages toward getting there. Just kind of like that. And then of course, along the way, you might teach, scapular protraction or like use plank pose to really teach how to push into the floor and lift your heart away from the floor and find that same action, which you'll eventually want in crow pose. I know that's not an example of a stepping point off crow, but just something that teachers might weave in as far as a quote component part. So if you kind of like stage it that way or progress it that way, then people kind of know. Like, I once had a teacher describe it as like, you could just choose to get off the bus at these different stops. And I like that. Yeah, like you've got the quote ultimate stop, but then you have all these stops along the way you can get off the bus. So that would be an example just off the top of my head for something like crow pose.
And so in doing that way, we just said you're giving people options for so they don't just think, well, we're doing crow and I have to do crow, but I can't do crow. What do I do? So it's okay. Well, I know that what I just did with my feet on the blocks was sufficiently challenging for me. So when we get to the next step and the teacher's offering people to take a crow, I'm going to stick to the one I just did and do that again.
Exactly. So they still have something productive they can do. It's not as discouraging. It's not like you could do crow or you can't do crow. And that's something that like our friend Catherine Wilkinson, I see her talk and write a lot about, yoga teacher trainer in South Africa, but she writes about how all too often, and in her experience in the yoga world with crow pose, for example, it would just be like, if you could do crow, come into crow. And if you can't, just
child's pose.
Yeah, exactly. It's just like, then there's no bridge between the two. And it's not very empowering for people.
And then you're never gonna, it's going to be really hard to get there if you're just like, well, I can't do crow, so I'm just going to take child's pose.
Just always going to take child's pose. Exactly. Right. Exactly.
But yeah, so it's giving people stopping points along the bus. It's teaching people how to break it down, or here are the components, and then just the idea. It's like a nice prolonged warm up, right? So
it's a very prolonged warm up. It's 70 to 80%. Yes.
So the idea is, if you walk in cold, you're not necessarily going to be able to embody pose as a crow pose as effectively as if you have this warm up period.
That's this like 70
you
to
might
80% of the class.
Might even hurt yourself.
If
you tried to do it before you were properly warmed up, right?
That's right. There's a potential for increased injury risk. Yeah. So I feel
not a guarantee or anything, but
no,
I mean, you could easily take a crow right now and you'd be fine.
Yeah.
But not everybody can.
That's right. It's so individual. It's so specific, but you're totally right. Like, yeah, many people who have done these poses for a long time can just bop into crow or into handstand in the middle of the day anytime, and it's fine. They don't need to prep for it. So these are some of the ideas for why peak pose sequencing can be helpful and make sense. But you and I have had some conversations before, and I think this is one of the reasons why it could be so valuable for us, whatever box we may be in. Like I'm coming to movement from a yoga box. You're coming to movement from like a strength and conditioning box, and other boxes as well, I know. But we tend to have these like primary modes through which we view the body and movement. And it can be, I think, really helpful to have conversations and engage and connect with people from outside our box who can open our eyes about things. Because I've always come to yoga sequencing with my yoga background, and that's the lens through which I view that. But in talking to you, I've had some huge realizations, at least huge to me, it's all relative, but really eye-opening realizations about sequencing and about how that peak pose, that typical peak pose sequencing style, can actually have some negative aspects or maybe not be so ideal in some ways. So we thought we could talk about that today as well.
Yeah. So my lens for this is there's an analogy that applies to strength training, and it applies to the idea of warming up. And so the analogy is, imagine that your energy levels, energy reserves are like a bag of sand. And so the minute you step into the gym, onto your yoga mat, the bag of sand is punctured and the sand begins exiting the bag. And so the idea is, the minute you start your practice, the sand is draining out. So you want to, there's a finite amount of sand. There you have a finite amount of energy. You want to make sure that you have enough energy, and you're allocating your sand effectively, right? So what the idea is, of course, we're recommending that people warm up, right? It's generally not a good idea to just go and start doing the hardest thing you're planning on doing that day right off the bat. There's a reason for warm up, enhanced performance, reduced risk of injury, all of that. But the idea is, if let's say you have an hour that you're planning on being active, and you spend an inordinate amount of time warming up, then by the time, and I've been guilty of this in the past, by the time you get to the workout, two things happen. One, you might be fatigued from if you did a really vigorous warm up, and two, you've run out of time, or you've taken precious time away from the workout and allocated it to the warm up. So then you get to the hour mark, and this might be more of a strength training context, but you have a lot of stuff planned for your workout, but you only have an hour, and you end up not being able to do the end because you wasted too much time warming up. So the idea is, well, let's find the optimal amount of time for the warm up. So the warm up isn't definitely not taking more time than the workout itself.
The actual quote training.
Yeah. So maybe in this example of an hour, you warm up for 10 to 15 to 20 minutes, and then your workout is 40 minutes. Or basically, the other way of thinking of it is, how short can I make the warm up so that I get the benefits from the warm up, and then I can go into the workout. So with that in mind, my question is, well, with peak pose sequencing, what you described is, we are building and building and building for the first maybe 80% of the practice or the time on the mat to this peak sequence or this peak pose. But what would happen if through that building process, you tired yourself out to the point that you weren't able to so much that you were not able to embody the goal pose as effectively as if you had a shorter warm-up period where you got yourself ready to go in the first 10 to 20 minutes, and then peak pose. We're just right off the bat, maybe 20 minutes into the hour, and then.
But then what would you do, Travis, with the whole rest of the class time?
Right.
Like after the peak pose, then you have all this time
you would have a 40-minute cooldown. No. So with peak pose, the idea is, we are all through those 40 minutes, we are creating acute adaptations that are going to allow us to embody the pose better in the moment.
Can you define acute versus chronic?
What I mean by acute is, we are working in that moment to activate, mobilize, prepare for this session, the session that we're in now.
Short term, like within session.
So within session, we are acutely preparing ourselves for the peak pose. That would be contrasted with a chronic adaptation, where we are strengthening, mobilizing, not preparing for that moment. Yeah. We're preparing for a later occasion. So the idea is, if you're desiring or trying to get at chronic adaptations, then you're not expecting what you do now to benefit you in that moment or in that session, but it's more about the bigger picture of, okay, the next time I try to visit this pose, I have previously built strength or mobility or whatever it is that you're after, balance. And so you get that for chronic. If you're working on something acutely, there will be chronic benefits, but it's a slight change of perspective, because what we're saying is, okay, warm up expediently for 20 minutes, now you are in your state of prime readiness for your peak pose. And then what do you do with the other 40 minutes? Well, you continue to work on things that would support, if crow, go back to crow example, if crow is your focus for that day, you would continue to work on breaking down aspects of crow with the thought process that I'm building my capacity for crow for a later
In a long-term
application.
manner.
Yeah.
Yeah, for chronic long-term adaptations.
So you can continue to work the protraction, the abdominal
flexion.
strength. Yeah. The
Condition your wrists, things like that.
Yeah. And you'll have done some of that in the warm up, just as much as you need to where you feel I'm ready. And then you do the thing, and then you can keep working on other aspects of it or the same aspects of it without having to worry about fatiguing yourself because you already did the thing.
That's right. You already did the thing, and you did it pretty early on rather than at the end because you're more primed to do it better.
And maybe I'm the only person who worries about this, but you know, in gearing up for this peak pose, you're like straddling this line between, okay, I'm trying to get myself ready and readier and readier, but I don't want to fatigue myself because then my readiness is decreasing. Well, if we do the pose earlier and then we devote the rest of the practice to more of the chronic adaptation, then we don't have to worry about fatigue at all because we're not.
That's right.
We're not trying to attempt this strong or deep pose after the fact. We can just go. We can go to failure, which is another conversation that doesn't we often don't hear in the yoga world. But let's say we're trying to build strength. You wouldn't often do chaturangas to failure because then like early on in a yoga practice, because then you couldn't do anymore. But if we didn't have to worry about overly fatiguing ourselves because we had gotten the hardest portion of the practice out of the way, then we could do some more fatiguing things that might have more chronic benefit without fear of overly fatiguing ourselves because of something coming up later.
It makes so much sense. Yeah, when you first reflected this to me about sequencing it, like I said, it blew my mind because I've never heard anybody in the yoga world talk about it this way. But if you think about a strength training context, it makes a lot of sense. And we know yoga's not strength training, but like in a typical strength training workout, what do you usually start off? I mean, you do warm up, but then you start off with.
So you do your warm up, whatever it is, for however long. Maybe it's 20 minutes. Maybe it's less.
Maybe less.
If it's more, then it could be becoming counterproductive because you want to get in a strength training practice. You'll get into your hardest thing first. Because if you don't do that, if you do your not hardest thing first, and then you try to do your hardest thing second or third, you've already wasted isn't really the right word, but yeah, you've allocated your energy, your sand,
some of your sand
to something else, so that when you get to your hardest thing, you aren't in your peak state of readiness. You don't have as much energy, and you're not going to carry it out as effectively.
As well.
Right. So if you're trying to, let's say you're trying to lift your heaviest weight for a certain number of reps. Well, if you've fatigued yourself already and then you go to do that, you're not going to get the outcome that you want. You're not going to perform at your best. So if we take it back to that sand analogy, if you wait until 80% of your sand is gone from your bag of sand, you just don't have as much energy in the tank to do this hard thing.
Yeah. 100%. And it makes so much sense to me in a strength context why you would start off your hardest, quote, biggest, most whole body movements first. Like you do them first, and then as you move through the workout.
It's not only is it a performance detriment, but it's an injury risk.
Yes.
To get to something big and where you need strength and power, and you've already locally fatigued your certain muscles. Then to put heavy weight in your hands or on your back is just not a smart idea.
That totally makes sense. And so, of course,
unless it's CrossFit. It's
totally.
it's
Oh my gosh.
and I say that kind of jokingly, but it's also true because you can imagine, let's say you're an athlete. You can imagine that in sport, you do have to perform well, powerfully, exert high forces in a state of fatigue. So it's not necessarily the case that you never want to train yourself that way to be able to do that, but you just have to think about what you're trying to get out of it. And
That's a great point.
So maybe most of the time you would do your hardest thing when you're fresh, but you could, if particularly for athletes, you want to make sure that they're also prepared to maintain integrity of their movement in a state of fatigue.
That totally makes sense.
But if you're working on crow,
yeah,
you don't want to
yeah.
you don't want to have fatigued yourself by doing a boatload of chaturangas and then try to do your thing.
100%.
But you do want to do a boatload of chaturangas to prepare yourself to gain the strength for crow pose.
In the long term.
Yes.
Right? Like not acutely, but chronically, you would want to work. Yeah.
But the way that you describe peak pose sequencing is once you've done the peak pose, then the rest of it's cool down.
That's right. That's right. So when you first suggested this, or through our conversations when this came up, and I was like, what? No one has ever said this in the yoga world that I've ever seen. I took that and I integrated that into a class I taught in my online class library that's called Handstand Play and Prep. And it's like a 30-minute practice, and it's totally based on your idea. But what we do in that class is handstand is obviously the peak. That's like what we're, quote, working toward. So we open with a brief warm-up that's just designed to warm up the body acutely for handstand. Then we move into, we don't just like, bam, just do handstand, but we do like a standing flow in which a bunch of handstand opportunities are woven in. So there's a bunch of opportunity for handstand really from the start. I mean, from the start post the warm-up. And that lasts, I forget how long, maybe 15 minutes. And then for the rest of the class, we just work on some mobility things and some end range strength things like shoulder flexion, lift offs, and wrist conditioning, and these movements that we do that will benefit handstand, but in the longer term. So the rest of the class is dedicated toward those more chronic adaptation type moves. And I loved how it came out.
And then all the people who took it were confused.
They're like, what are we doing?
Yeah, so that's right. The challenge, right, is meeting people's expectations because people tend to expect the peak pose to come later. And I haven't yet taken that class, but did you sort of preface, did you let people know that was what was going to go down? And if you were recommending other teachers who were thinking about incorporating this, would you recommend that they give some sort of caveat
Heads up
at the beginning of class, or let people know what's going to go down? And the reason I ask this, because I had not exactly related to this, but I once took a class that was, I guess it was a restorative class. I didn't know. I still don't know what it was, but I've told you this before. I went into the class thinking that I was doing a normal hatha
like an
class.
Active class. Yeah.
And so the first couple of poses were like longer holds, and I was like, oh, okay, this is the warm up. This is great. I'm feeling this. And then we did 6 poses the whole class, each 10 minutes long. And I was just like, when is the warm up going to end? What happened?
The whole class is a warm up.
Yeah. And so I realized eventually, like, okay, this is what this class is. But it didn't match my expectation, and it was confusing. So I guess my question,
satisfied.
It just wasn't what I thought it was going to be. And maybe if I had known what it was going to be, maybe I wouldn't have taken it, or maybe I would have.
Or your expectations
I wouldn't have been so confused. Yeah. So with that in mind, do you feel like that's something that a teacher, because it's so different, is that something that a teacher should let the students know, like, hey, we're going to do something a little different today, or not?
That's a great question. I mean, of course, I think it depends on the unique context in which you teach, who your students are, and what you're known for as a teacher. But I it's hard for me to remember because I filmed this class a few months ago now, but I think I did explain like why I was teaching it that way. And I know in the description, the written description, when you read it, it does explain like this is the order of the class. So I think I did feel, and even I know people, they kind of know my teaching to not necessarily be so conventional, but even so, I still felt the need to just, I didn't get into it too much because people just want to practice, but I did. Yeah. I think I did make a few comments about it. I think that would be appropriate. Yeah, it's just like this is a different way to sequence, try it on, see what you think. But I believe in the longer term, and of course it depends on what the peak pose is and what type of pose it is. But for
Yeah.
many types of peak poses, I think that this strategy is actually better in the long term for actually increasing your skill and capacity to do those
Right.
poses.
Yeah. So if your goal is really to do crow, the full expression of the pose, maybe in the long term, doing it like this is the way to go.
I think so. I think so.
For especially for a strong pose like that, but maybe also for poses that require deep ranges of motion too.
I could see that as well. Because
Maybe,
how long do you
maybe
need
not.
to warm up?
I don't know. Yeah,
It
I don't
kind of
know.
depends. Yeah.
Yeah,
It might be
maybe with
slightly
like
different.
maybe with like a forward fold, having that as the peak pose, it just makes sense to keep progressively building
Yeah, but how
towards
much
that
more
for that long.
will you like? How long do you really need
Yeah,
to warm up your max hip flexion or whatever? I mean, I know you need
that
some,
yeah
but how much
that's
do you
the
need?
question. Yeah,
Yeah.
and at
So
what
that
point
this
does
might be.
at what point does the warm up become counterproductive towards expression of that pose?
Yeah, and maybe it matters less when it's like a super flexy bendy pose. I have to think about that a little more. I think these are
Yeah.
good questions for us to think about moving forward. But I think so far in this discussion, we've really laid out well just this idea of how when me as a coming from a yoga background person talked to you and was hanging out with you as coming from more of a strength and conditioning background person, the two of us talking together can really result in like these new ideas that maybe neither of us would have thought before. But I definitely know in the yoga world, I'm sure someone has thought of this before, but I've never seen anybody talk about yoga sequencing that way. And I think that's
You've
the way
taken a
to
lot of yoga
go.
classes, right? And I've taken a lot of yoga
Yeah,
classes,
yeah.
and
And
I
I think it's just
haven't encountered one like that.
it's one way where cross talking between disciplines could actually could really be beneficial. So with that, I think that we can wrap up today's discussion. But I really appreciate all of the thoughts that you shared and the wisdom and insight that you've shared with us coming from your strength and conditioning and exercise science background. I know that we in the coming from the yoga world, we have a lot to learn from your perspective.
Well, I benefit equally from learning about the way that yoga classes are sequenced and how that can apply in my context.
Absolutely. That's why I feel so thankful that we've been able to connect and share with each other because it's really benefited, I think, how we both see the body and movement in general, which is so great. So thank you, Travis.
Thank you.